So welcome everyone. My name is Susan Schoenberger. I am Director of Communications at Hartford Seminary. And I want to thank you so much for being here tonight for this very important program. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your Zoom on speaker view and keep your microphone on mute unless you are one of the speakers. If you have a question during the program, I believe we will have time for questions toward the end. So please put your question in the chat as it comes up. I'd like to thank the Reverend Odell Montgomery Cooper for her efforts in putting this program together and for her extraordinary dedication over the years to Hartford Seminary, particularly to our Black Ministries program. I'd like to also thank all of you who donated to BMP as part of tonight's registration. So far, we've raised $355 for BMP, and I will also put a link in the chat so that if you'd like to donate during the program, you're welcome to do that. Now I'd like to just turn it over to Bishop Dr. Benjamin Watts, who is Faculty Associate in Religion and Community Life and Director of our Black Ministries program. So Dr. Watts, it is all yours.
Thank you so much, Susan. You always do a fantastic job in facilitating these programs and a wonderful job in keeping the seminary in the public eye and keeping our cause speeding on its way. I'm excited to welcome a wonderful group of panelists and to welcome all of you to this conversation tonight. This is a very important dialogue to have, given the state of our world, the state of the issues within it, the pandemic and the pandemic within the pandemic, which is systemic racism, and then the other issue which has been confronting us for a long time, which is that of trauma and violence and the difficulties that have gone along with it that have historical significance and really should be warrants a conversation like this and many, many more as we attempt to work through how we heal this nation and heal ourselves to be better as a nation and with one another. I'm going to go through now and take a moment and just introduce the panel. I'll close with the first person who's going to speak. So I'm going to do it in reverse order. And if the president, who is in another meeting, gets a chance to pop in, someone notify me in the chat, and I will make sure. I'd like to give him an opportunity to bring greetings as well as we are starting. This is a great dialogue tonight. We've got a wonderful panel. First on our panel is the Reverend Jean Amos Lease. Amos is a wonderful person, a graduate of BMP and also a graduate of our MA in Religious Studies here at Hartford Seminary. He has a master's in marriage and family therapy and is working diligently in that vocation. He is also a trustee of the Hartford Seminary, and he is an expert in domestic and family violence and serves as an adjunct within our BMP program and a part of the Alumni Association. I'm so glad to have you. Amos, wave your hand so everyone can see your face. There's Brother Amos. Also, let me welcome today Reverend Brenda Lammy. Reverend Lammy is a graduate of Central Connecticut State University. She also has a master's in divinity from Yale. She's also a graduate of our wonderful BMP program here and is a member of the BMP Alumni Association. She is a licensed clinical social worker, and she's serving as the permanent interim senior pastor. That's kind of an inside joke. She is the interim senior pastor at Greater New Life Christian Center and executive director of New Life Center for Recovery, and she's also an adjunct. Our friend and brother, the longest running scholar within BMP, he was with Bishop Tom Hoyt when BMP was founded, the Reverend Dr. Al Van Johnson, who is a graduate of BU. He has a bachelor's there. He has his doctorate from BU as well in the School of Theology. He is one of the long-serving pastors of the AME church rather, and has been a presiding elder. He is, I think he would put it, by age forced to retire, but not by strength or speed. So he is still teaching and working in the vocation, and he is a wonderful man of God. Also want to welcome the Reverend Portia Williams. We have dubbed her the baby of the bunch. She is a millennial, and she does an undergraduate work at Spelman College. She's a graduate of Yale Divinity School with her MDiv. She is a preacher, podcaster, practical theologian. She is a wonderful individual. She served as in training there at the Mount Airy Baptist Church in Bridgeport, pastor of youth, and has worked in at Bethany Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. And she's currently involved in digital content creation and June Productions, Portionality Media. Wave your hand, Reverend Portia, amen. And then Reverend Dion Bozea, I think I've got it close to right. Reverend, she has a Master of Divinity from Union Theological. I told her we still welcome her. We are excited to have her with us. She is a chaplain of the Church Center for the United Nations. She is the first woman of African descent to hold this position in the New York Ecumenical and Interfaith Landmark. She has come through and is part of Union Theological Seminary, Associate Director of Development and Alumni Relations, staff, student facilitator, and guest lecturer. She's chair of the Ecumenical Women at the United Nations and serves on several international and community boards. She is a preacher par excellence, and she is a 2020 inductee of the Martin Luther King Jr. Morehouse College Board of Preachers. And she's an associate at Mount Airy. Reverend Dion, welcome. Wave your hand, there she is, with her hands up. Namaste. And then the person that calls us to this gathering through her own life, her own living epistle of both struggle and triumph, the Reverend Odell Montgomery Cooper. Odell is a graduate of BMP and a graduate of Hartford Seminary, and her undergraduate degree is from Howard University, the Howard University. She is the executive director of Interruptions, dedicated to disrupt the silence and breaking the stigmas to mental health in communities of color. She currently has a new play that is coming up entitled Interruptions, Disturbing the Silence. She's the president of our BMP Alumni Association, and she is a preacher, ordained minister, and wonderful woman of God who's has turned her somewhat at times tragic story into triumph and has taught us all how to live in the midst of pain. With that introduction, if I may, let me just be sure we are excited to have you with us, and we are excited to have our president. I believe President Joel Lohr is online, and if I can, I'll ask him to bring us greetings at this time. President Lohr?
Yes,
oh, here he is. Thank you, sir. Well, before you say anything, let me just say one more word now that you're online. It is just tremendous to have a president that is passionately concerned about the community and all of the facets of our diverse community here at Hartford Seminary, and to continually have his support for conversations like this, for community engagement, to continue the work of BMP, and to expand it as we're seeking to do right now. And we're grateful and appreciative to his leadership. These are difficult times to be leader in. I'm sure he's looked around many a day and wondered, Lord, why me? And I'm so glad that the Lord chose him for such a time as this. Now with that, President Lohr, if you bring us greetings.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Watts. I'm just honored to be here with you today and to see so many familiar faces, new faces, but also just the incredible and intellectual prowess of this group, the way that you will help us learn. I'm here to learn and to listen. Dr. Watts, thank you for your leadership. Thank you everyone on this call. I see so many of you that have given leadership to the Black Ministries program, have supported our students, but also just been leaders in our country. Reverend Johnson, thank you for being here. Reverend Liss, thank you for being here. Disruptors, interrupters, I'd love to have a title of Executive Director of Interruptions. I just think, wow, thank you for all that you're doing to disrupt and to interrupt and to help us move forward in this country. Help me be accountable in our future. I just love the work that Ben is doing and through your support. But thank you for inviting me to be part of your conversations. I'm here to listen and learn, and that's what I'm going to do from this moment on in about 30 seconds. But I send my greetings from the students, the faculty, and the staff. Thank you for helping us learn, helping us become a better people. I'm a visitor in this country. I'm blessed to be part of it, even while I struggle with the structures and the things that we'll probably talk about tonight. As a Canadian, by the way, if that's not clear. But I'm a visitor, and I hope that I can be part of a solution rather than part of the problem. And we all have our blind spots. I certainly have mine, but I'm here to learn tonight. So thank you for inviting me and allowing me to speak. And greetings to all of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. With all of that said, I'm so delighted to give Odell the floor to kind of share with us how we've arrived at this moment and share her story and her journey with us. I'm going to ask everyone, if you would, if you're not speaking, to please mute yourself, and let's give opportunity for our dear sister to share.
All right. Namaste, everyone. Thank you for being here. Joe, Bishop Watts, Susan, and the panel. I thank you all for your time. I just want to start backwards in my story. This Saturday and Sunday will begin the first production, a virtual production of Interruptions, Disrupting the Silence, which is going to be able to be viewed online through YouTube. The tickets are free. So I did a lot of fundraising. So tickets are free to watch. You'll receive a link so you can watch it on YouTube. And this is my personal story. It's not anything I ever wanted to have to tell, but 4 years ago, my son was murdered at gun violence. I moved him from New Haven to New York so that he could have better options. And he was doing well in his career. He was working. He had just gotten off my medical plan, so I was very happy. And he came home at my request for an event that I was having at my job, and my daughter was in the culinary program. And that was supposed to be a very happy weekend. He went out to visit my sister, and while he was in my car with my nephew, he was murdered by mistaken identity. The phone call that a parent never wants to receive at 1:30 in the morning is that your child has been shot. I was told that he was shot, but it wasn't until that I arrived at the crime scene that I learned that he was murdered. I can tell you that the trauma of learning that information and the impact of being there, seeing the caution tape, is not the same as we see it on TV. I can tell you that my education and my faith had not prepared me for that event. I got it. My education or my faith had not prepared me for that event. The trauma that happened, I learned later that 3 hours after that event, my body automatically had PTSD, and the behaviors were immediately started to happen. We don't recognize that. We're not looking for that. We're not thinking about that, but my body was responding. I was angry with God, and I took it personal because I'm working for God, I'm serving in the church, I'm teaching, and I thought we had a pretty good relationship. So I was really angry that why couldn't God do more to save my child? And it was all the cliche comments that I received from the Christian community and from the circle that we are taught not to be angry at God. Things happen for a reason. You're a strong Black woman. You're going to get through this. Is not something anybody wants to hear at this point in time in their life. And the phone calls were coming in. How are you feeling? How are you doing? And what I do in the production is I'm honest, I'm transparent, and I actually decided to say I'm not okay and I'm angry. And people couldn't handle those responses. They didn't know how to respond. So there's a whole scene called Ask Me Another Question and people's responses to that. As a Christian, again, it was difficult and hard to get through. I had people in my church and in my community of faith calling me, giving me scriptures. Well, I knew the scriptures. I needed something else. I needed to hear something from pastors, people of seasoned in their faith, something that you know about God, something you believe about God that you can't preach or teach from the pulpit, but you can share with me to help me to get through and help me to understand. And I can tell you that the people that are on this panel are the ones that helped me to get through. Bishop Watts and Dr. Johnson and a few others, I'm not going to name everybody's name, had to do something very unconventional to help me get through this anger and pain that I had of losing my son. We are told to be quiet, not to talk about our pain, to be be quiet, get through it, go back to work, pick up a project. Your son doesn't want you to live like this. Those things were not helpful. They were more detriment than they were helpful in my journey of healing. And it took over about 6 to 9 months for me to break through of those cliches and those cultural beliefs that would allow me to start healing. And that's why we're here tonight. We're here to talk about, what we believe, what we've been taught, because today we have a compounded trauma going on in our families and in our lives. And that's with COVID-19. And we're inviting us tonight to have a conversation about faith and about our ministries and our practices and what we say, what we shouldn't say, what can we do differently, and to join us in disrupting the silence of being quiet and telling people they'll get through it. And, God needed another angel, all the cliches that we've been taught and we preach and teach, but to think differently about how we deal with grief and trauma. And that's my introduction, and I'm going to turn it back to Bishop. And we invite all of you all to listen, to ask questions, and to really join us in disrupting the silence in your communities and in your institutions of faith. Bishop?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Odell's story goes on much further than that, because as a result of the initial psychic trauma from the death of her son, the murder of her son, to be exact, the struggle became so real in working through it and handling the pressure of it that later on she ended up with physical trauma that was as great as the emotional trauma, and probably stimulated from the emotional trauma. And I don't know if you want to mention any of that as a lead into where we're going with some of these.
Yes, the internal stress that I was dealing with of being taught to not be angry with God, not to voice those opinions and to be quiet, elevated my stress level tremendously. And I had a brain aneurysm on my son's birth date. And doctors told my family to not have hope, not to, because I was bleeding for 24 hours in my head before I got to a doctor. And they said not to have hope because I wasn't going to make it. And prayers went out. And it was really, I knew that I could have quietly just slipped off and died. But I learned in that bed that I learned what it meant to give it to God and to fight for my life. And that was something that I've had to do, was to give God the pain and the grief and the anger, because I couldn't carry it anymore and fight for my life. And so now, since the brain aneurysm, that's why I'm here. I had to reinvent myself. My doctor said that I cannot return to work. I have some deficiencies that I'm living with and adjusting to. And with that, I was told to reinvent myself. And reinventing myself was not anything I ever planned to do. And that's where we are with the production that happens this Saturday and Sunday.
I thought it was important to put that part in case anyone left off the conversation early. I wanted you to realize that this is, it's about gun violence, you know, and what happens. And most people think that this conversation about gun violence would be about the major issues that we're looking at that are causing people to walk the streets. And those are very traumatic issues, and the community is really dealing with that. And there's a lot of pent-up frustration and anger, but there's also the other areas of violence and of trauma that are happening. And a part of this conversation this evening is to think about how can we come through or come to understand God's presence, and I guess with hope and healing during our trauma and during our grief. How do we come to know God's presence? As Odell was honest enough to share, and I think too often we're not honest enough to say, God, I'm angry. This is where I'm at. How can we come to understand God's presence through with hope and healing during trauma and grief? And I'm going to open up to our panel with that as a kind of a lead-in question to begin to think through trauma and grief. And I'm sure we're going to get to all of the larger issues, including systemic racism and the violence that it has caused. Is there any one of our panelists who want to take the lead on this first part? I see Dr. Johnson leaning forward. Dr. Johnson, if you would unmute yourself.
If it's all right, I would like to take the lead on this particular question, if it's all right with everyone. It is important for us to understand that when trauma strikes, especially trauma that leads to loss of loved ones, it causes us as human beings to question our faith. That is a natural reaction. And trauma often produces a feeling of separation from God. We begin to ask questions. Why God? Why me? Why doesn't God intervene? And all of the automatic responses to God. And I just like to recommend that while we are in that trauma, when trauma strikes, during that trauma, with the aid of prepared clergy, that we examine our expectations of God. My own personal bent is that we call for a total re-examination of anthropomorphism. It was really very, very helpful for a long period of time, but I'm not sure that it is the best understanding of God at this time. Far too many people see God as an anthropomorphic being, a being that lives in heaven with features like human beings. You know, we take a look at the icons in our churches, we look at all of the pictures of God in our Bibles, and I'm certainly convinced, even though I don't have a study of it, and maybe Dr. Laura will help me to finance one, but how many Christians come to church and see God as, quote unquote, the man upstairs, that God is out on some cloud and comes down and intervenes in human activity and returns. We give him a tip. It's what we call the cosmic bellhop theory. Comes, carries our baggage, and then we send him back to, quote unquote, to heaven. This anthropomorphism really is not as helpful to us for dealing with trauma as it really could be. I would like to recommend that if anybody hasn't seen it, that there is a book by Benjamin Mays. It's absolutely excellent. And what he does is he categorizes, he produces a topology of the categories of responses. And the first response is when trauma strikes, that people then, some people, the first response is atheism. People say, well, there is no God. People hanging from trees, people being shot in the back, people being choked to death on the street. And where is God? Well, the first thing, many people then say, well, there is no God. The second response is what we call laissez-faire, which is, again, anthropomorphic understanding of God. Let God come down and intervene. Let God do it. There's trauma, there are people killing one another. Let God, why doesn't God do something about it? The third response is what we call compensatory. That is to say, I can live through this trauma, I can make it, and when I get to heaven, I'm going to tell God how you treated me. Well, there is a fourth response that Mays talks about, and I, being a liberation theologian, I really recommend it highly, and that is to see ourselves as partners with a spiritual being that is absolutely omnipotent, but empowers us to transform the situation. We can transform society. We can assault the things that produce the trauma in the first place. So I'm calling for a re-examination of anthropomorphism. God is not a man upstairs, because both is wrong. God is not a man, thank God, and God is not upstairs. God is a spirit that dwells amongst us, and we must partner with that spirit to transform our situations. Lastly, pre-trauma, before we get into trauma, we need to have a spiritual understanding of God and develop that spirituality to increase our partnership with God and examine all of its facets. Because when we partner with God, we become powerful beings. And we can then transform the society that causes the trauma. We need, of course, we're talking about reforming the way we do policing, reforming the violence that causes people to kill one another. And once we develop that powerful relationship with God, we have then a spiritual fortitude that causes us, helps us, empowers us to respond to trauma with profundity. We can then endure and move through the trauma and not let it overwhelm us, and for us to maintain our sanity in the midst of trauma. So I'm calling for a theological re-examination of our understanding of God. And we need to look at how these images, you go to church, Jesus is white, Jesus has a blue eyes and a blonde hair. We go to look at some of these pictures and we find a long beard and a white bearded God whose finger, and the Sistine Chapel. But if we re-examine and have a profound spiritual relationship with God, we can conquer and examine and survive trauma much more successfully. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doc. Appreciate that. That's very wonderful, very wonderful book. Was there another one of our panelists that wanted to speak to this first question before I move? Amos, you were leaning forward. I don't know if that meant you wanted to say something.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Amos. Like Dr. Watt said, what I would like to add is I agree with Dr. Johnson and for what you are saying, well said. And then what I would like to add, sometimes feeling abandoned by God is a trauma in itself. Sometimes when we go through stuff in life, we go into the trauma, and then to feel like God is not on our side, to feel like, God, why me? Why is this happening to me? Can also be a trauma. Because for so many of us, we live our life thinking that God is on our side. And when that is not so, when that foundation is pulled from under us, that also is a trauma. And now the trauma is compound, it's double. In my practice, when I talk to clients, a lot of time is that feeling of abandonment by God that make the trauma much more challenging. I've been faithful, I've been serving, I'm a pastor, I'm a preacher, I've done all these things. And why does this thing happen to me? And seeking those answers also can be a form of trauma.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Portia?
Yes, thank you, Bishop Watts, if I may. In direct response to the question, right, how can we come to understand God's presence through hope and healing through our trauma and grief? And, you know, all of this is so real, right? And when we're going through asking these questions of God, like wondering where is God and feeling God's presence, in terms of the how, a lot of times we're looking outside of ourselves, right? We're looking to people, we're looking to our pastors, or we're looking to our friends, we're looking to everyone around us to help us, give us something so that we can hold on to it, right? What I've come to understand in my experience is that a very tangible way that we can understand God's presence is to look within ourselves, right? When I think about Howard Thurman and I think about the journey inward, I think about how we could push ourselves to rely on our sacred memories of who God is and who God has been. And so in the moments of feeling abandoned, in the moments of feeling like we're on the cross of Calvary and God is shutting up the skies, there are moments where we can have a connection within ourselves to remind ourselves of who God has been. And so undergoing the process of sacred memory, saying, if God has done this at this point, if God has done this at this point, it doesn't feel like it right now, but if I can believe in connecting to that belief and that hope, even in that anger, allowing them to sit in tension together and not ignoring or erasing it, but allowing us to sit in the tension of saying, if God could before, perhaps, just might, perhaps, based on what I know to be true about God for myself, not what everybody else says, but for myself, just maybe I can feel some comfort and some hope in this particular moment.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Watts, may I just, because all of these distinguished panelists, of course, have responded, have to say something, right? But I did want to just say ashe to all of what the panelists have said. And then you are talking about trauma, and we need to talk about defining what that is, and the trauma, of course, of the separation of feeling from God. But we've also found that we have been traumatized by humanity and humanity's actions and what has happened throughout history and all of that. But to answer the question, I think that what Pastor Portia has been saying is so true. I mean, along with all of us. But in Saki Shange, she is was a playwright, and God rest her soul. And she's the one who wrote for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. And there's a quote that she has said in one of her poems, choreo poems, and says, "I found God in myself and I loved her fierce." right? And so the notion that Pastor Portia was talking about seeing God in ourselves, we've always put God in a box many times. And we have a particular way, as Dr. Johnson was saying, that we have been taught to see who God is and how God looks and what God is supposed to be. And I think that if we can break out of that, that would help us. And so that if we can see not only the God in ourselves, but if we can see the God in each other. And if we could do that, then perhaps we can help each other journey through the kinds of traumas that we have been experiencing. So if I can say, I see the God in you and she is beautiful, right? Then we can journey together. If we can either see God in ourselves and in one another, we can journey through trauma and come to a different reality.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that struck me as we're talking about trauma, and we're going to have to keep redefining it even as we are expanding, as Linda Huff put in the group chat, thinking about expanding our understanding and view of God. One of the things that struck with me was the fact that when we talk about trauma, we all probably have different ways of thinking what trauma is to us individually. In Odell's case, the trauma begins with this gun violence, this shooting, this murder in the streets. And what really is interesting is that on his birthday, on Jonathan's birthday, that's when she ended up having the aneurysm. That the day itself, that coming around to that holiday, became a trigger. So that a single event does not stop with the single event. Sort of in the situation of the George Floyd's murder, that 8 minutes and 46 seconds may appear to be a single event, but all the events that preceded it were part of the explosion that happened after it, because there are things that trigger the trauma in us that bring it all up. Does anybody want to say anything about those trauma triggers? And I see Odell just moved up.
Yeah, I'll talk about some triggers for me. Originally, when my son came home, we were planning a 25th birthday party, save the date. And it went from a 25th save the date to me writing his obituary. And so any 25th birthday became a trigger. It was, I have to go back to work. This was the last place my family was at, very happy. So now I have to go back to work because I need to live, is now a trigger for me, because this was the last place we were as happy as a family. And I'm seeing him in the building, hearing his voice, and I'm not functioning properly. And people don't understand what's going on with me. I look the same, but inside of me, my body is crying and responding to trauma that I cannot explain. Songs that are being played, people, friends I could not see because they reminded me of my son, and different places and events. And what the problem is that when you all look at us, we look the same. But what's going on the inside of our body is explosive. It's like a grenade has gone off, and our behaviors and memory are just responding to these triggers. And if people aren't used to them, like I had never had triggers before, I didn't know what was going on until I crashed. And that's what I want to say about triggers.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we talk about constantly is the fact that anniversary triggers are very much a real thing. That there are anniversary triggers, but there are also scent triggers and visual triggers of sight or occasions that become triggers. Brenda, you want to talk anything about these triggers, and not just about the triggers, but maybe even about how do we allow our faith to kind of inform our process of overcoming? Dr. Lammy, Brenda, you have to unmute yourself. Brenda, if you don't unmute yourself, we can.
Okay, there it goes. It wasn't going. You know, when triggers hit people, as Odell was saying, it comes out of nowhere. You could be functioning just fine. You could be going through your normal day, going through a normal conversation, and all of a sudden something throws you off. And one of the things that does help people is when you have a strong social network, or you have been able to communicate to people around you some of the things you might be experiencing. When it first begins to happen, you don't, as Odell said, you don't know what's going on. But as you begin to kind of experience certain behaviors or situations, and you are thrown off, to be able to have someone to call, to be able to talk. One of the things I often tell people is, please don't suffer in silence. A lot of times that's what people that are undergoing grief and trauma situations, they find themselves closed off. And then it's like, okay, and this is, I believe when the other panelists were talking about how do we understand God in the midst of this alonement, in the midst of this abandonment, and to be able to, I just believe it's so important to begin to reach out to somebody and to be able to talk and to be able to, yes, we pray together, but one of the biggest things that people need to know is that I'm not alone. Somebody gets me. Sometimes it's not a whole lot of talking that needs to go on, but it's presence. And God is in the midst of us, you know, and how we respond to each other. But also the opposite can happen, where the whole opposite of God, and that is, who is God? But ultimately of love, but ultimately it's a presence that is a foundation for us. And when we have people that may not know what to say, they may see you acting oddly, they may hear you all of a sudden clam up or see you clam up, and then it's like, well, what's wrong with them? And sometimes people do the opposite. They don't call them, they won't follow up, they won't check in because they don't know what to say. And so I think as we as a church have a responsibility to really train ourselves as clergy people, and there's so many layers to trauma because of what's going on in our society, and we just really have to, I think, do a better job at how we respond to people and make sure we're present with them. Just lastly, you know, I'm just thinking about just as a church body, we do a great job when someone passes. We're all at the funeral, we do the repast and the whole bit. But this trauma thing goes on for years and years and years. Grief, mourning goes on for years. And how do we be responsible to our people, to one another, and understanding where people are, and to be able to make a commitment to be able to make a difference? And I'll leave it there.
Dion?
Dr. Watts, I wanted just to say too, I think we cannot be here and not talk about, as you mentioned, we would be talking about the systemic racism and the things that have been going on. We need to talk about how this kind of trauma has existed for millennia within the Black community, and within, historical trauma that we have inherited and that we have carried with us. And this is something that has come from from our ancestors, and that we have then inherited, and then we are suffering through. right? So that not only do we remember the Ma'afa, we remember sort of those who have came through the transatlantic slave trade, those who have come off of the shores of the continent, right? And then those who remain. Then we think about the trauma that has gone down from the Jim and Jane Crow. We think about the trauma that has gone down through civil rights, and then on and on and on. I think about the trauma that we always are seeing now from Rodney King. I know I'm dating myself back here, but and even before Rodney King, but Abner Louima, and then the Sean Bells and the Trayvon Martins, and then the Eric Garners and the Michael Browns, and then the Breonna Taylors. I mean, you're triggered every single time you see one more Black body being killed, and we're seeing it repetitively. But this kind of trauma that we're talking about is one that is historical. I mean, this is from generation through generation that we have been carried, and it manifests in our bodies, right? And and then what we haven't talked about, and I hope that we do get an opportunity to talk about later, is then the response to trauma. One of the responses, which is the grief, which is what we have been doing as collectively for years. And now what we are doing in our society now is grieving, right? In a major way. But we're talking about vicarious trauma that we are seeing that happens from afar. We can be right here in wherever you are, whether it's in Connecticut or you're in New York, wherever you may be, but you feel that. You feel what has happened to one more Black body that has been that has been shot, lynched, that has been. I mean, we're seeing it, and so that our bodies hold the trauma and hold all of it, so that when like Pastor Odell, when she then remembers what should be a happy thing, what should be a joyful thing, it automatically comes because she's holding it in her body. This is chronic trauma, right? That she's holding her body, and then your body responds to it. So I think I'd like for us to be able to acknowledge that's happened, and that's not, and acknowledge that it happens everywhere and with everybody, but particularly with Black and brown people. We have to really say and not ignore the historical and the generational, the trauma that has happened and that we carry with us through generations.
It's very important that we do that, because I think that a part of this conversation is to really recognize that the trauma is not a singular incident. It's not a singular generation. It's transgeneration, intergenerational. It has been passed down. It is a legacy of trauma, and all of it has a way of coming up. And what happens. As I spoke on Sunday, many people could not have picked Kenosha out on a map, would have had asked what state it was in. But it was almost as though that was a familiar person, even a familial linkage, when he is killed in that manner. And so that every issue or every incident becomes another layer of trauma onto existing trauma. And it becomes more and more painful. And you can see it starting to wear. And you almost hear people actually saying, I'm tired of carrying it. It's too heavy. And others might ask, what's heavy? Well, it's not any one thing. It's all of it. It's all of it.
Multiple, yes.
Dr. J, you just leaned in.
Yes, Dr. Watts, I wanted to augment what both you and Dr. Dion have said, is that I'm about the business of developing allies. While we are the Black diaspora, we are embedded in a traumatic society. This entire society is filled with violence. There are 3,075,000 1,000 guns on the streets of America, and that there's one for every man, woman, and child in our entire country and all of its territories. There are guns on the street, and people want to solve their problems with the immediacy of violence and just using guns. But that is something that not only triggers and traumatizes the Black community, but we also realize that our sisters and brothers of European descent and Latin descent also are suffering from this traumatic violence that pervades this entire society. And I hear Reverend Dion saying that when we see God in ourselves and God in others, we'll see God in every ethnicity, other people, and we can join together to transform this society. Because every time you turn on the news and we hear someone is killed, no matter what their ethnicity, that also triggers the trauma that we individually have experienced. So there are triggers all around us every day. And we have to work together to transform this society, and let's reduce the amount of violence that each and every one of us are exposed to each and every day. So I'm hoping and trusting that we can garner allies to help us to reduce the nature and the character of this country.
Dr. Johnson is right. And I say yes to that. But every time I turn on the TV and what we're seeing is a Black body that's being shot. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't want to at all minimize it. And I say yes, because that is the answer. If we can see God in one another, all of God's creation, right? But I think particularly how we have talked about this, because this is one of the things that Reverend Odell was talking about, how we then deal with this within the Black and brown communities. And I think that, again, with the 1.2 million people being shot in America alone by guns, when you talk about the statistics of that, there is more than half of that are Black bodies that are the ones that are being shot, right? Or that the ones that we are seeing, right? And I'm getting statistics from Giffords, which talks about gun violence. So I just want to say that we have to be responsible for all God's creation, but in particular, what we're talking about now is the kinds of traumas that we're seeing with Black bodies, right? And the kinds of traumas that we're seeing, and that all of us have got to be in the business of caring about that so that we can begin caring then for all of the souls going forward. And then how we talk about the grief, how we then treat that, how as a church, what are the words and the language that we're talking about to help people get through this, right? And the people are everybody, all God's people. But again, I can't, in this season and in this time, what we have been seeing broadcast is a particular people being the ones that are targeted now. And so how do we do that? And how do we nurture that and help us all then so that we can care for the souls of all God's people?
I think one of the issues right now for us in terms of recognizing these triggers that are in the news and now put forward, we are blessed to live in an age of technology that allows us to see what we have experienced in silence in the community or only in colloquial or familial conversation. So now, because we're able to see it, now the rest of the world is starting to see what we have already been discussing and recognizing. And so we've dealt with that sort of acute trauma, but now we are dealing currently with what I think is really a complex trauma, because it's multiple traumas all coming in, and it's very complex, and they're triggering. And what we want to do is, in the midst of all of this, to allow our faith. Where does our faith come in to bring us into relationship with God and relationship with one another, where we do not become bitter or angry, but we find other ways of speaking and of breaking the silence, in Odell's language, of interrupting the silence, so that we interrupted all of the churchiness, as Inez would say, all of the church cliches and all of those things. And now we're going to say, no, I'm not going to be silent about it anymore. I want to say something, but I don't just want to say it outside of the community, on the street in protest, but within the community, even within the church. All of us need to recognize this is happening. How do we deal with it? And we can't act like it's not real, because we're being triggered by it every day. Amos, I see you want to get in on this.
Yes. I think Reverend Dion put it well. I'd like to add, I think Portia will be able to talk about this also. Over the summer, I worked with about 65 high school kids from 14 to 17. And the goal was to talk to them about grief and loss and give them some coping skill to deal with grief and loss. And I went into this project thinking that most of them were gonna be talking about COVID-19 and the loss of the school year, the social, the distance learning. But most of them, the concern was about the violence they've seen on TV, the Black bodies that are being shown, people being killed. And to tell you the truth, the anxiety level, the fear, the angriness is there. And these young people, I was not prepared for it. I knew it was there, but to that level, to that extent, I was not prepared for it. So how can we, as a church body or people of faith, give these young people the language and the coping skill they need to process them? Because they are seeing it. Even in my own family members, one of my family members, she's only 8 years old. She's having nightmare about being shot by police, right? So that the trauma is not just adult, but it's going down to our young kids because they are plugged into social media. They're seeing what's going on. So what does the church has to say to them? How do we give them the language and the coping skill to be able to process it? And can they honestly talk about it without other people tell them, hey, shush, don't talk about this. Don't, suck it up. God is good. God is on your side. So can we create sacred space, safe space, where they can freely and honestly put those feelings and emotions out there?
Thank you. And I wanted to add to that, when I started talking about what I was going through, my circle said, I never paid attention to your daughter. They were so concentrating on the adults. We overlooked the siblings. We overlooked the best friends who read about this on social media. My daughter learned that her brother was murdered because someone immediately posted on social media. And how do you respond to that? We have to, I encourage all of us, when we go back to examine what we preach and what we teach, is to not overlook the entire family and the friends and the young ones who are hearing all of this information and don't have the words to express their anger, but it's coming out in their behaviors. And when they go to school, then they are labeled as troublemakers and something is wrong with them. But it's the trauma and the grief and stress that they're expressing at a young age through their behaviors because they don't have the words. It's important to disrupt our past practices of not saying you need to pray more or have more faith or in time things are going to look better for you. That's not what we need to hear. But that's what we've been taught in our church. That's what we've been taught in our families and our culture. That's what our friends tell us. I encourage you all, You may not know what to say, but just sit with the person and just be present and let whatever happens, happens. But we have to, I encourage all of us to re-examine us and how we interact and deal with people, because we may not physically be in your churches, but if we're on your roll, if we're in your cell phones and your emails, and check in with us, because people are traumatized, and even more so with COVID-19, drug addiction, abuse, it's all trauma and it's all grief, loss of job, it's all grief. And what this is about is to re-examining our past conversations and our past languages that have to change because they don't work. We have to do something different.
Yeah, I just want to jump in, if that's okay. I agree with you, Reverend O, like wholeheartedly, right? I really appreciate you even naming like how people forgot about Jackie, right? How people forgot to ask you about your daughter, because particularly for millennials, particularly for Generation Z, as someone who's past Gen Z, people automatically, I should say adults, let me be specific, adults assume that they don't have language, or that we don't understand what's going on, or that we don't have a way of processing grief or processing trauma and grieving, because our grief doesn't look the same as everyone else's, right? You know, because we are digital natives. We have social media. We have, you know, TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. So the grief process looks different, right? There is taking it to social media and tweeting your feelings before maybe telling a parent. Maybe you're going to DM somebody or take a photo and post a RIP picture. Maybe you're actually going to leave the house and go to your cousins and go to the street, and you know, maybe you're going to pour something out, also known as a libation, by another name. Okay, because these are still traditional things, just by different names. So we wonder, does anyone care to hear, right? There's one thing to say that people care for young people, and then there's another thing for young people to feel cared for, okay? Like, so y'all catch that? It's one thing to say I care, and then it's another thing to say they feel cared for. And so young people are grieving, right? I actually had a teenager say to me recently with some of the Black Lives Matter traumas, right? I had one of a teenager say to me, Reverend Portia, I'm tired of white complacency. My white friends want to be allies and they want to jump in and help, but they don't know how to help because their parents don't know how to talk to them about it. So if we're going to heal as a community, regardless of what it is, especially with gun violence, because how in the world can Tamir Rice have a BB gun or what appears to look like a gun and be shot and killed, or Trayvon Martin have Skittles and be shot and killed, but yet we see this kid in Kenosha who has a gun get shot, shoot protesters and walk away? How is it that Dylan Roof gets to get McDonald's or Burger King, and then yet we see 9 people who are gone, right? How are people having access to these guns? And so when I hear young people ask me questions about white complacency, that isn't to say that white people don't care about Black death or Black trauma. It's to say, what are Caucasian brothers and sisters teaching their children about the value for Black life? And that conversation needs to happen in our own communities, regardless of what color we are and regardless of what race we are. What are we doing as adults to talk to our young people about valuing life? Because if we tell the truth, a lot of the young people who are doing these gang shootings, a lot of them are teenagers. A lot of them are under 25. And how can we teach the value of life, that saying having a gun is not the answer? Having a gun and pointing it in someone's face and shooting, or someone trying to get revenge because somebody, hurt your cousin over here and you want to do a revenge kill, that's not okay. When can we as adults be responsible to have these conversations with our young people to say, we have to value life, right? Regardless, across the table. And I think when we have these conversations, we realize just how much we don't value life, how much we don't appreciate life until the life is gone. And if we have these internal conversations at home, at the kitchen table, or at the beauty shop, or the barbershop, or at church, wherever people are gathering to gather around to say, life is so precious. Let's not resort to guns. Let's not resort to knives, whatever it is, right? We all have a responsibility in community and communal trauma. We all have a responsibility to help piecing through and combing through and understanding how we can grieve together, because you're not just hurting one person, right? When we inflict pain, when we inflict trauma, or when trauma happens to our home, it's not affecting one person. It literally breaks down the entire family structure and a community, because that person was loved by somebody. You know, regardless, that person was loved by somebody. And it makes me so sad to see other young people grieving together, but not grieving with their parents, grieving with other people, but not communicating, right? When are we gonna understand that communication is still key, right? We communicate in marriages, we communicate on our jobs. Well, we gotta communicate at home, right? We just have to communicate at home, because our children are hurting too. They're watching it, they're seeing it, and they're crying. And they may not be communicating it with parents, but guess what? Parents, we have to be responsible. Adults, we have to be responsible to also ask and check in with them, even if they don't want to hear it. We got to try. We have to try the best we can that invites them to feel safe. I know for me, when I was a teenager, I can admit, even still talking about gun violence can be triggering to me. Anytime I hear something that sounds like a gun is triggering, because I grew up in the hood, right? I'm a first generation college student. I grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. That it is what it is, right? And still some sounds are still triggering for me, even as an adult. But my parents would not understand how these conversations are, how these things are triggering if I don't communicate. So I'm learning how to communicate at 30, but I also think about that 13-year-old who does not yet know how to do that. And so for me as a millennial, my responsibility is, how do we allow ourselves to have conversation? And how can we facilitate conversation? And so that's what I want to put out for that point. Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful. You really lead me into this next section of this dialogue. One of the things we hope to come from this is there are a lot of uncomfortable conversations that need to happen in places where I'm not necessarily going to be at. And hopefully everyone on this Zoom and those who will watch it later need to give some thought to having those conversations around trauma, around grief, around communal trauma, this complex trauma, all of the areas of trauma within their context, within their local ministries. And so that leads us to this idea of how do we help people create informed ministries that can put together resources to address the multiple traumas that are going on. And then how do we even facilitate those conversations that may not be happening in our own context? And so let's talk a little bit about kind of almost the next step of moving the conversation so that people will start thinking about, we need to talk about this. While we talk about Black and brown bodies in the streets, this nation is not going to be changed as a result of what African Americans do exclusively, or what Latinx family members do exclusively. It's going to be changed when people become not just simply not racist, but anti-racist, not simply a bystander viewing the world with a compassionate heart, but a person that's willing to interject their heart and their work into this change that needs to be made. And a lot of that has to happen in places that I'm not going to be standing. I want to open the conversation with this. How do we open up to create informed ministries? Go ahead, Reverend Deanna, so you light up.
I want to say, what Pastor Portia was saying is so important, and in terms of having that communication. So to respond to what you're asking now is can we have the adult to adult conversation, right? So that we can even then begin to have it with the youth, with our children, and with the children and the young people in our community.
Let me say this before you finish your point. I think part of the problem of not having the child conversation is we won't have an adult to adult.
That's exactly right.
If we don't have an adult to adult, how are we going to talk to the children? We don't have the language in some cases.
Thank you.
But please go ahead.
I want to say yes. So that's exactly my point, is to say that the part I think is of the reason why we're not having these conversations, intergenerational conversations, is because we're not having them with the adults who already have the preconceived notions, who have been birthed into societies where racialized violence is norm, right? Where when we talk about racism, when we talk about white supremacy, it is norm. Some of the things that the privilege that some of us have been born into is norm, and so we look at things. So when we don't see Black bodies or Black lives to matter, so the cry for it to be heard and to matter is, how many times do we have to say that for people to then look and see that every life, that our lives are significant, right? And that every life that God has created is significant and is a sacred life. So I think that the conversation has to happen. How we begin to have these conversations in our ministries and to be able to have trauma-informed ministries is, one, we have to include all of the generations in the conversation, because the people that are experiencing it, the people who have gone through it, we need to, I wish that we were not in this COVID situation so that we could bring droves of people to see Interruptions this weekend, because, Reverend Ina is just magical in the way in which she does anything, right? So I know that her direction is going to be wonderful, but to hear Reverend O's story and to begin to have a conversation, a real dialogue about how we interrupt the racial violence and how we interrupt the death-dealing language that we have had in our churches, rather than the life-giving language that we have within our sacred spaces, to help people then deal with it. And this is a wonderful book, and many people know David Kessler because he wrote the book on 5 stages of grief, right? So when we talk about the 5 stages of grief that people may or may not know, this denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right? But he talks about a 6th stage, which is meaning. Right. And I think that that's where we begin, is how do we make meaning out of some of the grief? How do we make meaning out of the traumas that we have been experiencing? The multiple traumas within our society, within our communities, within our families. How do we make meaning out of that? And then can we be vulnerable enough? Can we be truth tellers enough to say, you are hurting me? To say this is not okay, and to be willing to stay at the table to hear what we all have to say about the realities that we've been living. And so I believe that is one of the ways in which we're going to be able to start to develop more trauma-informed ministries that change language, that we say, I'm sorry for your loss, or where the ministry of presence is just enough, where we don't feel like we got to say the wrong stuff to re-traumatize the person who's going through grief, right? I think this is where we start, having us sit at the table and stay at the table, be honest and to be transparent and to be willing to hear the hard stuff and to do the work. I think that's where we begin.
Thank you. Part of my pain was hearing people say the cliches. And when they asked me how was I feeling and I told the truth, they couldn't handle it. And they stopped calling. They didn't want to be around me anymore. When I wanted to cry, when I was crying, people disappeared, because I'm the crying mother. That's all I do is cry. It's like in the movie 12 Years a Slave, when the woman loses her child and she's on the porch and she's crying and the community is annoyed with her. That's what we do. We are annoyed with the people who are traumatized, and the only way they know how to express themselves is to be honest and to cry and to, I want to talk. And people walk away from us. They don't want to be there for that. And it's important to re-examine all of us, to re-examine our language, what we preach, what we teach in Sunday school, to be able to show a different side of the scriptures. And, yes, we love David, and David did great and wonderful things in the Bible, but David wasn't a good father when his daughter was raped. He didn't protect his daughter, told his daughter to be quiet. It's all in the family. That's not good. When do we give voice and power to our pain? So you may not know what to say, but to say, shh, you'll get through it. To say, pray more, and to walk away from us is not what we needed. It's not what I needed, and it's not what we need now, because we are spiritually, physically, mentally dying. We look good on the outside, but we are dying on the inside. And it is the inside that you all have to look inside of someone, look in their eyes, sit with them, feel them, and to say, we need to have a different ministry.
I think the hardest thing to do is to join the fellowship of suffering, to weep with those who weep and to mourn with those who mourn. Because to do so, you have to give something up, which is your comfort. And once you do that, you now have engaged in a whole new, more meaningful way of being present. And everybody doesn't want to participate in the suffering of another. They don't want to help another person bear their burden. And that's the hardest thing, but I think it's the most compassionate thing we can do, is to enter into the pain of another. Reverend Brenda, I saw your light up over there, and then I see Brother Alvan is ready and Brother Lisa's ready. So Reverend Brenda, go for it.
Okay, be real quick. One of the mistakes I think people often make is they assume people experience pain, grief, trauma the way they've experienced it. And so so they'll share things of, way back when I've worked with many people maybe that have gone through rape, who've gone through some horrendous things in their lives. And when they feel like and a lot of people are in addiction. I work with people in recovery right now. And when people have come to a place where they feel like they're kind of overcoming some of it, they'll be like, well, I want to go help people that I've gone, so that they can get some healing the way I've gotten healing. But yet they begin to approach it like, this is what I've experienced, and so now I'm going to share with you what happened to me, and this is what I need. And everybody everybody has their own journey. Everybody has their own way of grieving. Everyone has their own way of how they're dealing with the challenges and the atrocities that have happened in their life. And so we have to, while present, we have to truly be open with ourselves, and it can get raw sometimes. Our feelings can get hurt sometimes because we don't want to hear certain things. And it is so important that we know that the faith, the God in this means that when we say God is always present with us. So if God is always present with us, he's present with us when we're feeling good. He's present with us when we're not feeling good. That's the presence we have to have with each other. We have to be present with each other so like when Odell and when we were coming together and I said, Odell, I got to make time with you. I didn't always know what to say to her. But she knew that I heard her. She knew I was hearing where she was at. For me to say, I got all the answers for you, of course I don't, because her journey is her journey. I needed to be able to receive where she was at and to be able to maybe, if I didn't have the answers, maybe help give her some suggestions to someone who did. But the point is to leave people alone, and for us not to come collectively together with them, I'm hearing as Dion shared and Portia, coming together as a body, as a unified body, to speak truth and then to be able to live truth. And that's the only way transformation happens. If we're not ready to really delve into truth, each other's truth, then where do we go? But I do believe there's hope. I know that people's hearts are turning in the right direction, and we've got to do something. We are in a crisis. Our country's in a crisis. Our communities are in a crisis. Our people are in a crisis, and we have got to do what needs to be done so that we can go forward. And I know Interruptions, I'm so excited about this project because this is truly leading us in that direction. And I'm so grateful to Odell for really being the vessel to help lead this. Thank you, Odell, for all you're doing.
Excellent, excellent. Reverend Johnson, then I'm coming over to Amos.
Well, I just wanted to inject something that you alluded to earlier. When we look at the whole problem of violence and gun violence, and it's an American problem. And you talked about anti-racism, and we're looking at the COVID pandemic. All of these are American problems. And then you mentioned that we should have honest conversation. I just wanted to share with you that there's a sign up in England that says, all Americans must be accompanied by an adult. I thought that was so humorous, that we must have an adult conversation about it, and we need to talk about transforming the mentality of this entire society. And like Obama said, if we lift everyone, we'll get all people. We'll get the Native Americans, and we'll get everybody if we just reduce the amount of violence in the entire society. And that requires an adult conversation.
Adult conversation. Thank you. Reverend Amos?
Yes, what I'd like to add to this, I've seen a lot of ministries trying to offer mental health help for the people that they just don't know how to do it. They're going about the wrong way. So I think for those in leadership in ministries, they need to know that it's okay to refer people out. There have to be a partnership between faith leaders and mental health professionals, right? Because I'm sick and tired of trying to see well-meaning pastors or doctors or faith leaders who are not staying in their lanes. They're trying to address trauma that they don't have the skill, the training to do. So because you are doing ministry, that doesn't if it's not your lane, it's not your lane. So it's okay to seek partnership with outside mental health professionals to help. And this is what I've been trying to help churches do. Yeah, you may not have the language, you may not have the know-how, but there are people who do. So, and I'm one of them. And the other thing I also, when I see church in ministries, a lot of times that not all emotions are welcome, right? So, and so sometimes we label the emotion. This is a negative feeling, so don't talk about it. So in order for this to be effective, all feelings, all emotion has to be welcome. And when I'm expressing my anger, that has to be okay. My sadness, my shame, my outrage, my whatever the feeling is, it has to be welcome, and we have to sit with it without trying to hide it so many times. A lot of time we sit with that pain, we sit with that feeling, but we try to hide it. Can we let it out? And I think we need to create enough sacred space, enough safe space where people of faith can say, yes, man, this is jacked up, I'm messed up, I'm outraged, I'm angry, I'm sad, whatever the emotion is, that needs to happen.
Amen. Amen and amen.
You know, the thing that if you, hopefully you will sign up and join us with Interruptions, one of the things that is so important about Odell's honesty and transparency is the fact that even as a minister, she's willing to not only let us into the back room of her prayer time and her pain time, so that we can then see the passion she has for God, and when that passion is sapped away by pain. And it's so important that we realize that sometimes we try to be people of faith and try to act as though we're okay when we're not. And it has to be okay to not be okay. It has to be okay to say you're not okay. And it has to be okay within our ministries to make space for people to not be okay and to walk with them. Not just adult people, but young people. With that said, I want to just remind you, there are a number of great resources. I've seen Brett put some up there, so Brian put some up there for books that are in our chat line. Also, I want to just say that, Dr. Johnson, if you give us the title of the book you mentioned earlier, so we can send that out when we report out about this time of dialogue. If I can take a few moments to go around and ask each of you to kind of give us a closing statement of something you really would have wanted to say, but you didn't get a chance to say, because with such a big panel, there's so much more we all could say. But let's just go around. Let me start with Portia, because she's so profound, articulate young person. Young by our standards, but you're getting pretty old now. You're not going to be able to claim it much longer. So enjoy it these last few days. Let's start with her, and then we'll everybody make a kind of a closing statement of something that you really wanted to share that couldn't come out in these last hour or so. Portia?
Yeah, thank you, Bishop. I appreciate you. So what I wanted to say, and this is for me a closing remark, is when I think about Calvary, and I think about the trauma of that day, and I think about the trauma that Jesus went through, the trauma of those who were next to him, the trauma of those who were witnessing, the grief of the women. And I also think about the grief of the disciples who were not there. I want to extend grace to the disciples. A lot of times, I can admit, I tease them for not being there. Oh, the brothers weren't there when Jesus needed them. But I would want to say that everyone grieves and is going through different things and engaging trauma differently. Some of us can be there in the moment, in the thick of it, at the cross, in the thick of it, right? Some of us may need to stay home, and some of us may need to be in community that's not public. Because when we are grieving the loss of someone that we love so dearly, we don't know how that trauma impacts that person. And so some of us, maybe we have to retreat and retract. That doesn't mean that we're not grieving. Some of us, we can be right there in the thick of it. We can be right there at the cross. We can be right there holding each other, crying, and all of that. Some of us may not be able to show up until the aftermath. Maybe we might show up at the tomb. Maybe some of us won't be around until, like Thomas, just trying to figure out, making sense of all of what just happened. What I am saying is, wherever we are in that story around a singular event that of a traumatic event that impacts everyone, it's okay to be where you are. And that just because you are where you are does not mean that there is no love, and that it's okay. You know, it's really okay to be where you are and how you process. And yeah, I want to leave you all with that it's okay to be where you are. And the grace that is afforded to us in that process, that is where we can also find God meeting us as well.
Thank you so much. Reverend Dion, come on.
I was having my own moment there listening to Pastor Portia. To that I say ashe to all of it. I want to, in closing, if I can leave something with us, is just to be honest with yourself, to be gentle with yourself, And if you need to cry, if you need to cuss, if you need to sit in silence, your rage is okay. But I want us to see ourselves and to see one another as the precious souls that God has created us to be. Then we can actually do some work. But I also want to say everybody's not going to be able to journey with us, and that we have to come to grips with that. Everybody is not going to be able to be with us, walking with us through every part of our journey. And there are going to be people that are going to be able to join you in the different stages of grief and the waves of grief as they come, because grief is not linear, and the way that we deal and handle it is not. Right. So I want for us to honor one another, honor what we have, what we come with, what we're still carrying. Those of us who can help lighten the load, let us do that. And those of us who need to sit out, let us do that. And us to manage our expectations and not try and diagnose, because sometimes we misdiagnose people when we're not the ones to do it. Let others do their job. But I also want us to say again, to see yourself as God has created us. And so I see the God in you, and she is beautiful. So I pray that we can see the same thing in everybody else. Amen.
Thank you. Reverend Brenda. You have to unmute yourself, sis.
There we go. One of the key reasons for interruptions for this webinar is to bring awareness to trauma, awareness to grief, awareness to the pain that people are going through. And the word that comes to my mind around this is around being intentional. And this whole process of interruptions and coming together in unity to really discuss these issues, it is a great step in us really being intentional and encouraging our churches, our pastors, our church leaders, to really take hold of this pain, the concern that's going on that we're talking about tonight, and to really have a think tank in our churches to go back and say, what are we doing? How are we being responsive to our people in our churches? So my hope is that this is really an impetus for us to continue these conversations and to really put some meat on the bones of the ministries that we offer in our churches, so that we are available to our people.
Thank you. Reverend Amos.
Yes. What I'd like to add to in closing is self-care, right? Because we need to, as we do this work, we need to take care of ourselves. Because if we're not taking care of ourselves, we're not good to anybody else. So it's okay sometimes to take a day off. It's okay to get some quiet time. It's okay to unplug for a little while so you can take care of yourself. Because self-care is incredibly important. And the other thing I'd like to also add is, every time I'm in a meeting like this, I think about my privilege. The fact that this is a seminary, we can be on Zoom right now, it's in itself a privilege. Because right here in the city of Hartford, they had to get a grant to provide Wi-Fi for the whole city so kids can have access to the internet for distance learning. So the fact that we can sit here and talk about these issues, it is a privilege. So let's not forget that, because there are people out there right now, people we may know, who may not even sure where the next meal is coming from. Right? People we know, I've worked with right now, who are going through tremendous amount of grief and loss. And we need to be mindful of that as we engage in this dialogue. Think about our privilege and the responsibility, because we have that privilege, to be actively working to make this world a better place.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Reverend Dr. Alvan.
Yes, to Bishop Watts and to President Lohr and to the panelists, I would like to rise for a point of personal privilege, and I would like to encourage and invite everyone that is on this conversation and future subsequent conversations to seriously, very seriously consider coming and studying with us in the Black Ministries program, which is a very excellent battery in biblical scholarship. We try our best to delve theologically into the depths of the understanding of God, and we address social issues. And we will have 2 years to discuss all of the issues that we just brushed past today. So I would like to invite every last one who either themselves want to pursue these issues, or you know someone that would benefit from these kinds of discussions, to please, please consider the Black Ministries program, which is a product and project of Hartford Seminary. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you.
And thank you for including me in this
last
conversation.
word. Reverend Odell.
Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity tonight. To our president, Bishop Watts, Susan, thank you, Amos, trustee, and the panel. I called you and you responded and said yes. So my heart goes out to all of you all who took time out of your day to be here this evening. Interruptions, disrupting the silence, is exactly what it means. My interruptions was gun violence, but there are many people that you know whose life interruptions is something else. And it looks very different. But it's important that when the production comes out, if you can see it, and eventually it's going to be available, but it is designed to start having conversations that are difficult to have. You may not know how to have them, but to use this production to say, what is this character going through? Why did she do that? What's the behavior behind this? And then to recognize a characteristic that you've seen in yourself or someone else sees and figure out, let's talk about it. So it is designed to have conversation. There's a workbook that's going to be following it to help with dialogue and conversations for new ministries. But that's what it's for, to start having conversations, breaking the silence, and to know that the way that we used to provide grief and counseling and support doesn't work. We have to do more. Pray more. Don't get angry. Don't go to counseling. You'll be okay in the morning. You're strong. You'll get through this. Doesn't work. So try to not say those things. And that's what Interruptions does. I was challenged in this production because we had an interruption. The lead character, who was playing myself, had an interruption and she had to leave the set a week before we filmed. And I had to play myself. And that was challenging within itself. But I learned that I was a teacher, I was a preacher, and I see MT is on. I am a storyteller. So those are the different hats that I wore to tell my story. So when you look at it and say, why did she do that? The question is, what did you learn from it? So it is to start conversations to help people heal. And I hope that you take advantage of it, because that's what it's for.
Odell, before you close, tell
yes.
everybody how they can see the production.
So Susan's, I see she's putting information in there. You can go to Eventbrite and you can look up Interruptions, Disrupting the Silence. You can search through it through Eventbrite. If you're on social media, it's on Hartford Seminary's page, the BMP page. It's on my page. It's on LinkedIn under my profile. And when you order your ticket, you will receive a link an hour before the show, and you'll be able to watch it on YouTube and watch it for free and have discussions. And there's a community conversation that we're going to have afterwards. And I believe the director is still in the room, and she is awesome with telling the story of our ancestors through trauma. So she held my pain and challenged me very well in this piece. And please, if I can go through it again, you can watch it for the first time.
That's the Reverend Inez Anderson.
Yes.
We mentioned, I think, the word Myafa earlier. Reverend Dion mentioned it. And for those of you that don't know what the Myafa is, we want to make sure you're aware, and that's talking about the legacy of what we can call many ways, but let's just talk about in terms of transgenerational trauma. It is the trauma of the Middle Passage. It is looking back to see forward. And many communities, not just African-American communities, many communities have transgenerational trauma. My Jewish brothers and sisters have it, going all the way back to Egypt. My Native American brothers and sisters have it from the very founding of this nation, the Trail of Tears, and even now to this day, sacred lands being taken for profiteering and oil mongering. Many groups have it, and we carry it in our DNA. We carry it in our bones, and we revisit it with triggers that happen. Trauma happens. How we deal with it is up to us. And as people of faith, we can deal with it better if we learn to use our faith in examining our trauma, having difficult conversations, disrupting the silence, and making the world a little better place. Thank you so much, Reverend Odell. Thank each of you for joining us tonight. We will look forward to talking with you. Sister Susan, if we've done everything we should have done.
Oh my gosh, yes, you have. And thank you all so much for coming. Odell, I wish you all the best this weekend with your performance. And please, everyone, take a look at that Eventbrite link that was just posted so you can find out how to see the performance. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to all the panelists. What a tremendous service you have done for everyone witnessing this event. So have a very good night all, and we will see you soon, I hope, at another Hartford Seminary event. Thank you.
Amen. Namaste to you all.
Namaste. God bless you.
Blessings.